So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time for my talk today. I'll be sharing a bit about codifying responsible AI. So if you enter the talk thinking about we are going to be talking about the methods, how to code responsible AI, I'm afraid this is not the right talk for you. So there are plenty of resources out there on the web. You can check out the different toolkits, Phelan, IBM 360, etc. that talks about how you can possibly code responsible AI. But I think that focusing a lot on the methods and metric sort of misses the forest for the trees. So in our consulting work, talking with companies about implementing responsible AI practices, I think there's a tendency for a lot of people to think about such issues in terms of maybe particular algorithms, right? So maybe like how we can use Lime algorithm, how we can use Shapley algorithms, or particular metrics, for example, equality of opportunity, disparate impact, etc. But that only captures one slice of the areas of what we term as responsible AI. And so I decided to frame this talk in the larger context and help us think about why we need to codify responsible AI and how we can sort of approach it. So this talk focuses on the issues of fairness, because responsible AI is actually quite a huge multidisciplinary aspect that contains about different aspects of things as well. But I'll be focusing a bit on fairness in this talk. And just as a caveat as well, the biases as used in this talk refers to more of the social biases or cognitive biases, not necessarily in the statistical sense of the term, right? So let's get down to it. So a short interlude. So about myself, I am Timothy, the founder of Cylynx. We are a RegTech startup based in Singapore. We help our companies build AI solutions, from fraud analytics solutions to thinking about issues around responsible AI practices. Recently, we won the MAS Global Veritas Challenge. That's a competition organized by the Singapore Central Bank to encourage financial institutions to evaluate their AI and data analytics solutions around the principles of fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency. So that is an initiative that has been 2 years in the running already. And we are also helping the financial institutions to think about this responsible AI space and how we can come up with various solutions to help them better circumvent some of the problems, for example, model documentation and testing. So that's where we came up with Verify ML, which is the award-winning solution for the Veritas Challenge. About myself, more in detail, my background is in economics and data science. So this particular area of sort of responsible AI sort of brings me back to where I started off my career in, namely in the area of policy impact and evaluation. And I think that that's something that's really, really exciting. And it's a really nice area to see more people entering and taking time to really think about the effects that AI and machine learning models have on society, on customers. Right. So I think a useful way to set the stage is to think about the negative side effects of AI and machine learning models. You might have, for example, negative performance such that the self-driving car doesn't recognize zebra crossings or pedestrian crossings. But we also have such problems in the areas of social aspects of things. For example, the Google Photos racist algorithms which tag Black people as gorillas, or the Amazon gender bias recruitment tool, which favored men over women in the area of hiring practices. So in such a scenario of AI gone rogue, I would like to pose a question and ask, how would such a scenario look like for the financial services sector? In taking the consideration time, I came out with a case study over here where we have a fintech situation where this lending model discriminates against African Americans by charging them higher basis points for mortgages. It's not that far-fetched a scenario, because this is actually based on a UC Berkeley study back in 2018. We found that I think African Americans, at least industry-wide as a whole, were charged about 3.6 basis points higher. I think Latinos were even higher, about 7 basis points. So when we encounter such a scenario, would like to think of it, right? There's a newspaper published about such a scenario. A company is figured negatively in the press. How are we going to think about such a situation? To conduct a post-mortem of this rogue algorithm, we can think about it this way. What happens a few seconds before the results are served? What happens days before? What happens months before? And what happened years before? I think framing it in such a scenario gives us a broader context and appreciation of how the different pieces of information are interconnected and how biases sort of cascades from one process to the next. Eventually, we can then come up with different mitigation strategies, or even better, be more proactive and think about what are the possible steps you can implement to prevent such problems from even occurring in the first place. So let's take a look and go into seconds before we have this rogue result. So we are at the model serving step, where this model is giving us 3.6 basis points higher for African Americans compared to maybe white Americans. So over here, something we can ask straight away is whether the inputs to our models are captured correctly. So very often there's a divergence between how data is recorded and pre-processed at the collection stage versus what are we actually serving in production time. And these can affect the different performance of the model at the time where it's being served. Also equally important is how the channels and methods of service affects the users of the solution. So if this model is now being used, for example, if a lending model is used in a smartphone application, we can think that it will affect maybe people of different age groups and people of different gender groups differently, right? In terms of how they interact with the application and how they actually key in their details over there. So both the channel and methods of the service actually matters in terms of the final delivery of the results. We can take a step back and look at the model deployment process and ask whether there's any data drift. Right? We can also look and ask whether there has been any regressions in the new model's performance. So there's a slight dichotomy between the two. If a model is not being updated, you can expect there to be a lot of data drift, and maybe now the new customers that are applying are no longer representative of the old data that the model is being trained on. But if we are going to update the model frequently, and something as important as a key lending model, are we sure that the new model that we're putting in production actually is consistent, has consistent performance as something that we have deployed in the past, and whether whether we can be confident that we are not falling into any pitfalls and that the new model continues to perform as we intended for it to be. So taking a step even further back, we can talk about it months before and the model's development process. So over here, we even asked like the first questions, whether we have initially considered the benefits and harms to the various groups that we're affecting. This might be various racial groups, this might be different gender groups, this might be different age groups. If we have not even considered such groups and how the model might affect them, then it's completely obvious that we would be expecting, we can't expect the model to perform as we actually intend it to, right? Because we have not even taken into account how these models might affect them. So that's normally a very good starting point. And we can also ask whether any personal attributes or proxies are being used to train the model. So the model will learn to discriminate based on these personal attributes. Normally in the banking scenario, it's sort of like it's not allowed for such PII or protected information to be used in the models. But a common pitfall is the use of proxies. So for example, if schooling data is included in the model, then that might that obviously has a correlation with particular racial groups of students, right, applying to these schools, and you'll see the impact on the model's results as well, because these machine learning models are able to pick up such attributes from proxy variables such as schooling or zip code. Next, are the right objectives then being optimized for? So over here, you might think that maybe in a lending model, it's relatively straightforward. We are just looking at the information about maybe the default rates. But if we are thinking about it in a responsible AI practice, maybe our objectives should not only be that. Maybe we should add a certain kinds of constraints such that we meet certain requirements on how the model performs for various groups. Or even better, try to maximize various objectives at the same time, right? One part on fairness and one part on performance. The tricky issue over there is how are you going to weigh these two different objectives together in our sort of cost minimization function. Now, if you can take another step back, we approach the data collection phase. This is a step where the data gets fed into the model, but there are oftentimes a lot of issues in terms of how the data is collected because it's historical data collection. We might not have a good sense of how they are collected. And one can ask whether it's actually representative of our target population. So oftentimes, especially because there are existing biases in the data collection process as well, we're not clear on how the data is generated. So this cascades down to the eventual model training and the eventual results. One other food gun to keep in mind is about historical bias. So and it's very common, for example, that it's the existing lending practices have sort of historical biases towards particular segments of society. And if such data from lending officers are fed back to the model, then it's definitely not strange that you continue to perpetuate this social culture prejudices. So overall, I have outlined 10 different points you can think about when we talk about how to evaluate whether a model is responsible or fair or continues to perform for. And I'd like to put it back to the Singapore context, right? And talk about this Veritas initiative that's going on. So this initiative, as I mentioned, tries to nudge and encourage financial institutions to take a closer look at the models that they're deploying and frame certain kinds of fairness requirements and ask themselves how machine learning and AI models are going to affect consumers and society. So financial institutions are supposed to evaluate the trade-offs between these fairness objectives and stake a claim in terms of their value judgments and how that translates down to affect customers and society. So if there's the takeaway from this is that we have also created a tool called Verify ML to gather inputs from different stakeholders within the financial institution and to provide a tool for compliance team, product owners, as well as data scientists to come together so that they're able to consolidate such information in one place. Right? So this spans all the way from the initial documentation to the model creation to the final evaluation and testing of the entire procedure. But this is not the only way to do it. And I do not want to sort of prescribe certain kinds of methods and what are better or not, what's better or not. If anything, I think this is the takeaway I want to leave you at the end of the talk. Right? So instead of waiting for this postmortem to happen on a biased rogue lending algorithm, let's be proactive and think about how we can implement responsible AI practices in our modeling steps in our organizations. So the takeaways over here are just some common sense points that's extracted and distilled from the 10 principles that I outlined earlier. So responsible AI practices involve multiple stakeholders that include product owners, data scientists, data officers, risk and compliance team. We have to take all their inputs together before we can come up with a proper pipeline and proper approach to the problem. It's an interconnected process, right, that flows again from data collection to model development, deployment, and serving. If you don't take into consideration this whole interconnectedness between the entire process, we definitely fall into pitfalls along the way. And while data science mitigation techniques and tools are very helpful, they are not a panacea, right? So we have to understand the social, cultural aspects of things as well and integrate them together. Better data governance, documentation, and ML ops practices. So the simple essentials, along with robust testing procedures, really go a long way to help avoid such unintended biases. So I think with these principles in mind, that sort of forms a good foundation, and we can start talking about how we can then implement and codify responsible AI. So thank you everyone for listening to the talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay. Wow. Thank you, Timothy, for the really interesting talk. And I believe that bias and fairness in AI, responsible AI, they are all like really interesting topics for everybody in the room. And I believe there'll be a lot of questions. I would like to open up the floor now for questions and answers. All right. Okay. So we have one now. Okay. You mentioned that one consideration in model development would be getting the right objectives. So, for instance, for optimizing, do you have any guidance or best practices on how data scientists should go about this in a safe way?
Yeah. So I think it's very much a process of data exploration, and to look at it from a holistic perspective, right? So instead of only focusing on, let's say, one particular outcome, maybe the false positive rates or the accuracy score of the model, we can consider it how that false positive rate varies across various demographic subsegments, and we can also consider, for example, how the accuracy score also varies across different subsegments. And it's only by sort of having a thorough understanding about how the model could potentially affect different groups and segments of society, then can we better able to say how are we going to tweak our algorithm such that it performs in a fair and performant manner as well.
I see. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the answer. Okay, we have another one. Models are in varying levels of adoption across industries, right? So in your experience, how well do you think these different industries are doing across Southeast Asia? And how are they thinking about fairness? Is everybody handling this well? Do you see any gaps currently? Yeah.
So I think that's a really complicated question, right? As you mentioned, because industry adoption varies so much. Regulations also vary significantly across the Southeast Asia sector. So, for example, I think other regulators are sort of catching up, but Singapore's this Veritas FEAT principles, it's also more of a recommendation and not really set into regulation yet. So a lot of it is still on the onuses of companies to set their own internal guidelines and procedures. But there's also a lot for them on the line, right? Not only in terms of regulation, because by having better credit lending models, for example, that is a driver for getting better businesses. In the sense that you're not denying people who would actually take up loans and could actually repay them just because there is this historical bias in your data, and just because you do not understand such existing patterns that sort of contribute to unfair lending models. So I think organizations themselves are trying drastically to improve such internal processes and to have better governance around it. But it's a complex field that everyone is still navigating, and the additional complexity because we have all this reliance on additional third-party models, third-party data, etc. So everyone is still trying to figure out various pieces of the puzzles around it.
I see. Yeah, sounds like there's a huge market gap for Veritas ML to get into, right? Yeah. Okay, folks. So unfortunately, we have ran out of time to take any more questions, but we can answer some of these questions offline through the chat. And thank you very much, Timothy, for your talk.